Does maintaining healthy public finances mean making a painful decision to remove support for vulnerable communities, especially as we head towards winter, as has been the case with the removal of winter fuel allowance for pensioners who are not on pension credit? At what point do we say enough is enough, since the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, and the word Ofgem in short, a non-governmental department and regulator of the gas and electricity networks, already stated that the average fuel cost shall go up from 1st of October 2024. Well, welcome to Debt Talk Podcast with me, your host, Ripon Ray. You may have guessed what I'm going to be speaking about this month, and that is pensioners and winter fuel payment. To speak about this subject, Ian Samuel, a former social worker who is now a pensioner and recently had a health scare and has begun campaigning against the removal of winter fuel payment. I also have Matthew Cole, head of Fuel Bank Foundation, who will give an overview of what experience from the foundation's fuel advice. My panelists are also to give top tips to drive changes for the benefit of pensioners in months to come. So let me start with Ian, who wrote to his local MP because he's furious about the current government's removal and is now campaigning against it. Ian, what made you go extra mile to write to your MP about this subject?
As a former social worker who worked with adults, including pensioners, for a number of years here in London, and as a former worker within the benefit system, I contacted the MP because I was really angry at the Labour government choosing this issue to fight over, given the level of health and wealth inequality that exists. And after the dreadful years of the recent Tory administrations. So I kind of felt angry. I had a response from the MP. I can't say it was a standard reply, and that kind of aggrieved me a bit too. And I wasn't really convinced by the argument that the increase in the state pension was going to in any way cover the massive increase in the cost of utilities and the level of food prices and the like in recent years. So that was kind of the background to me talking to friends and encouraging them to do the same thing, really.
For you, Ian, what does the removal of winter fuel payment mean?
I would have received it for the first time this year, but will not now. My income, my work pension and my state pension exceed pension credit levels, which are basically, in my view, way too low. And that has a profound impact on the quality of life that a pensioner can have in this day and age, with major implications for their ability to, with social inclusion. So for me, it means I won't get it. But my concern was the millions that will no longer receive the winter fuel allowance. That was my concern for taking the matter up.
But you must be getting any other subsidies. So if you did, what form of subsidies and support would you be getting as a single person?
I mean, essentially that I'm a single guy, so I receive a council tax discount, but um, I I don't receive I don't qualify for any other benefits as things stand at present. I mean, you mentioned at the outset that I'd had a recent health scare, and as a result, I have a chronic heart condition, sudden onset, and it was of a life-changing nature. And as a result, it necessitates me keeping warm, and it had implications for mobility and fatigue levels. But in saying that, I don't meet the conditions for applying for attendance allowance as things stand. It may arise in the future, but at the moment it doesn't. And so again, my concern is for other pensioners with health conditions, with mobility impairments, who already have major financial issues, and these are going to be compounded by, the recent increase in the cost of fuel, and at the same time, the loss of the winter fuel allowance. And from the point of view of my experience as a social worker who worked with adults, including those of pension age, it, fuel poverty was something that I encountered a lot. I have come across uh, pensioners on prepayment meters with no funds to top up their meters. And when that happens, on a Friday afternoon, and there's no family support and there's no ready access to funds, I can recall those days. And it's not my belief that things are any easier. They're probably even more difficult now.
Being a single man, having
Yeah,
had that health scare, did you think
I
about
mean,
the security element of it, or what could the
yeah,
implication could be?
profound implications for uh, my or one's sense of security and safety. Self-confidence as well takes a profound knock. And I became reliant upon friends locally to assist me with day-to-day tasks when I was recovering from the acute episode. I'm aware my family live in Scotland, so I'm aware that with many elderly people, they may not have support networks locally. Um, so there was a need for psychological support. I mean, a lot of this came from the NHS, as you might imagine, rather than necessarily from social services per se. But psychological support, you know, occupational therapy support in terms of banisters at home, seating aids, the potential for level access shower, things that I discovered that I needed in the light of the acute health crisis that I went through. So it kind of there was that sort of help was mercifully available to me, um, but it necessitates obviously being able to negotiate different systems and being able to access them either by telephone or digitally. I mean, I had the benefit of being used to talking to doctors and nurses and other therapists in my role as a social worker. I'm aware lots of people don't. Um, I had taken out some insurance, which paid out on my acute health episode, but I'm well aware that many people may not be in a position to have that benefit. Otherwise, I might have had to wait a lot longer for means tested support from the local authority to have a decent shower put in that I could access, for instance. I paid for it through insurance, but many people won't have that. So it's back to the issue of being reliant upon um, income maximization, benefit maximization, the stigma associated with making benefit claims. It was something I came across as a visiting officer in the benefit system and also as a social worker, as I say. The claim forms are lengthy, they're complex. There are difficulties arising if someone's mother tongue is not in English, the impact of dementia and capacity to make informed decisions. Some of the claim forms are like books in themselves. So there are major issues with claiming benefits, which is obviously key in the issue of the removal of the winter fuel allowance from so many.
You've heard that Ofgem already mentioned that there is to be an increase in the cost of energy by, on average, by 10%. What does that mean to you?
I'm lucky in the sense that I was able to put aside money for the winter months, but there are many who will not be in that position. And as I say, that was my major concern about kind of raising this issue.
And what do you want to see happen if there's a change in the current policy? And what do you want to say to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor?
From a personal point of view, I think that the legislation that was passed is profoundly wrong in the sense so many will lose the allowance because pension credit levels are so low that if one's a pound over the limit, the very low limit as it is, then you're going to lose all of the winter fuel allowance. So there's like literally a cliff edge, and I think that's profoundly wrong. So why wasn't it tapered? The benefit system is way too complex. It's not easy to navigate, and there's no guarantee of any successful outcome. And my concern is that whilst I understand the need for a massive take-up campaign and signing people up for pension credit, I don't know if the resources are there, frankly, in order to ensure that everyone who's entitled is helped. And it's not just pension credit, because you've got to consider those pensioners that might qualify for attendance allowance too. Your local authority may be running, sessions to help with benefit take up, but that assumes that someone can get there. There are mobility issues, as I've alluded to earlier.
So thank you, Ian. Let me get Matthew Cole from the Fuel Bank Foundation into the conversation. Matthew, based on what you've heard from Ian, where does his experience fit in with yours and your organisation?
What Ian has voiced, many people across the UK are also fearing and are genuinely worried about what winter will mean for people, especially people on low income, and doubly especially those people on a low income who are pensioners. And I think for one reason only, really, that I think there's always a glimmer of hope for people who are below pensionable age, that if push comes to shove, you might be able to work some extra hours or get some extra money through employment. Well, I think for most people who have retired, there's kind of a sense that option isn't always available, even though there may completely be the will to want to do it. There aren't those opportunities. So we talk a lot about people being on fixed incomes. I think for pensioners in particular, if you're on a fixed income and you're seeing energy prices, like you said a few moments ago, going up 10, 15%, it goes from being something you're slightly worried about to something you're hugely worried about. And so what Ian has articulated now, I think other people around the country are facing similar thoughts too.
From your own, I suppose, contact with customers and pensioners, what are they saying to you?
So I think there was some confusion about the changes to the winter fuel payment. I think, to be honest, actually, we've been contacted by a number of pensioners who kind of understand the logic for the change. I think things are quite tight financially, but are worried about two things. One is about the pace and the speed of the change. So it feels like it was announced a few weeks ago and it's going live in a few weeks' time. Often policy changes are announced the year before, so you can kind of think about the mitigation you want to put in place. And then the other thing which I'm hearing from people is concerns about the cliff edge which has been created. So if you're a single pensioner and you earn less than 11,000 or so, you receive pension credit, you receive winter fuel payment. If you earn say nearly 12,000, you won't get it at all. And that's that cliff edge. I don't think is particularly great. We at Fuel Bank have been arguing for some sort of tapering. So as people are slightly more affluent, they get slightly less support, and that maybe seems a more progressive way of doing things. You see in the papers all the time examples of people being £2.58 over the threshold, so they then lose lots of money, and I don't think that's particularly great. That's not great with this example or any other benefits or support system too. There needs to be a tapering of support as support drifts away as people are more affluent.
What is your thought on what the government is saying about balance the books and local councils are working on deficit budget?
So I think we're in a really difficult position. Also, I'd reflect on the fact that when Winter Fuel Payment was developed by the Tony Blair government at the end of the last century, which feels a crazy long time ago, 80% of pensioners were in poverty or thereabouts. So things are really different nowadays. Yes, there are still pensioners who are absolutely really struggling. Pensioners aren't struggling in the same way they were before, in kind of general terms. And so I think that was what drove the government actually to say, if we can provide some support, where should we be providing it? We spoke to the government, and we tentatively support the changes to Winter Fuel Payment, but we want to see some of the savings which have been made being used to provide more support to people who really need it. So net, no less money is spent, but more money goes to those people who desperately need it. Because that's what, Winter Fuel Payment is there to keep people warm over winter. And you always hear the examples, don't you, of Richard Branson living on a Caribbean island claiming Winter Fuel Payments, which I don't think he did. And I don't think he was able to anyway. But just kind of go with me on this. You kind of hear these stories of really affluent pensioners not needing it. I think what worries me is that kind of this line in the sand now, where we say, sorry, the only people who need Winter Fuel Payment will be those people who are on pension credits, and I think that line has been drawn too low. And so that's what the question you asked me a couple of moments ago. What are we hearing at Fuel Bank? That's what we're hearing. Just kind of apprehension, nervousness. I hope that they can get through winter. I hope that it's a mild winter. And I think to Ian's point, if you have pensioners who are living alone, or maybe don't have a family close by, or maybe don't have a large support network, winter can be a really scary prospect. And it's now going to become doubly scary.
On a broader scale of things, if we look at the overall national landscape around pensioners and poverty, what are we seeing?
So if I look through a fuel poverty lens, fuel poverty is measured in different ways in different countries of the UK because it's a devolved policy area. But somewhere between 25% to a third of people in different countries are in fuel poverty on average. But actually, organisations like Fuel Bank are tending to see more younger people in acute fuel poverty nowadays, especially maybe families with young kids. What I really don't think we should end up in, though, is kind of world where we're kind of trading off one group of people against another group of people. It ultimately should be, whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're male, whether you're female, etc., those people who are struggling to heat their home, they should be the people who get support. And so I would see, a reformulated Winter Fuel Payment should go to anybody who's struggling to heat their home, regardless of kind of where they are age-wise or geography-wise.
Ofgem already stated that there is an increase in cost of fuel on average by 10%. What does it mean for you?
We support people who traditionally prepay for their energy. So they're topping up as they go. When they need energy, they're paying for it. And what that means over winter is that they'll be topping up even more than they had to previously. A lot of people talk around prepayment, metered customers pay more for their energy, and they don't actually. Their rates have been set to just below what those people who pay by direct debit pay, which is a good thing. But because a direct debit customer, they spread the cost of their energy over 12 months. So there's no peak or trough, just an average figure. Where somebody who prepays, they have to top up more as they use more, and they will use more as it gets colder and darker and into winter. Last year, the average prepayment customer was paying £313 more over winter than their neighbour who paid by direct debit. And when you consider that somebody who has a prepayment meter is probably more likely to be on a fixed income, more likely to be on a low income, maybe not have access to, I don't know, rainy day savings, because kind of what we've been through as a country over the last few years with the cost of living crisis and COVID before that, that's kind of the challenge. And so people who have a prepayment meter who are on a very, very low income are probably going to spend some time this winter rationing their energy, or actually letting their meter switch off and then topping it up again when they next get money going into their bank account. And that's something we see quite clearly. You know, at Fuel Bank, we're expecting to see about 500,000 people this year who are in that situation. They're people who are living without energy or will be shortly. There are protections in place, which means that only those people who the energy company has determined can manage with a prepayment meter can have a prepayment meter. One of the things that we worry about at Fuel Bank is that things change lately over time. Somebody may have had a prepayment meter installed when they were 55. Their health was good. They were working. Prepayment was safe and practicable. But fast forward 10 years or so, that person might be 65. Their health may not be in such a great place. They might not have the same level of mobility. A prepayment meter switching off could have a material impact on their health and on their well-being. And that's what we worry about, is although there are checks in place to make sure that prepayment is safe, for some people, we know that it's probably not. Like last month, 43% of the people who came into Fuel Bank said to us that there was a critical need for energy in their home. So that could be the very old, the very young, the very poorly, the very cold. And so that's what we spend time talking to government and Ofgem, the regulator, and the energy suppliers about. Make sure that prepayment is safe. It's really important.
We've seen that there is a huge campaign for pensioners to apply for pension credit to avoid not receiving a winter fuel payment. So how would that change the situation for many pensioners, or would it?
So pension credit is one of these crazy benefits, if you like, that it becomes the passport to so many other things. But it's also quite a complicated process to go through. You have to have lots of information, lots of evidence, and lots of time. And sometimes it can feel that it's too complicated to apply. And some people maybe are stigmatized or have had a really bad experience previously, so don't. So we're encouraging everybody to claim pension credit who's entitled to it. I saw some figures in the Observer a couple of days ago, and it suggested that if everybody who was entitled for pension credit claimed it, the savings that the winter fuel payments is going to deliver would be eaten up by the pension credit payments they've got to make. And what I really hope is that everybody does claim it who should, because actually you with pension credit you can then automatically receive winter fuel payment, but then also as well you'll get support for things like council tax. If you rent a home, you'll get support from your local authority on pay for housing costs too. There are other benefits which start to kick in. And so maybe I'm being super optimistic, but I really hope this talk of the winter fuel payment, for once and for all, really drives a wholesale take-up of pension credit to kind of close that gap. Because it really worries me there are pensioners living in the UK or people living in the UK without access to heat, light and power. And it worries me even more that there can actually be support available, but people aren't able to access it. And to Ian's point, he talks about being a social worker in a previous life. It must have, I guess, really, I'm putting words into his mouth. It must really have frustrated him, though, when he knows there's support available, but people aren't accessing it. And sometimes that's what we need to really focus on. How do we make sure that people get what they're entitled to?
So we mentioned about the pension credit. So what are the criteria and how do people claim pension credit?
So pension credit is a income related benefit. It's for very sensibly actually to protect the people on the lowest income who've retired and to give them a top up to get to a reasonable standard of living. The eligibility criteria are on the DWP website with like paper booklets available. Ian talks about Citizens Advice, Age UK and other support agencies. Those organisations are great at helping people receive pension credit. And it is quite a complex process to apply for it. I would just urge anybody who's listening, it's really important if you think it might be eligible for you, or even more importantly, for any of your family or friends or neighbours, just make sure they're claiming it.
Where does Fuel Bank Foundation fit in with helping communities struggling financially, and how do you help?
So it's dead simple, really. We're just a food bank, but for electricity or gas. And so rather than providing people with emergency box of cereal or tins of beans, we provide people with emergency electricity and gas. And so we're helping those people who are kind of living without. People access our services to a network of about 800 or so partners across the UK. And our model is really simple. It's really hard to have a conversation about maybe maximizing income or doing a benefits health check if people are living in a cold home, because at that point you're kind of in survival mode. You know, if you've got kids at school, you're thinking, how do I wash their clothes or dry their clothes before school tomorrow morning? If you're a pensioner, you're thinking, I can't cope not having a hot drink before I go to bed tonight. And so therefore providing an umpteen page document to fill in isn't going to happen, because people are in crisis, are in survival mode. So we really simply get the house warm. Then we use that period of respite we're providing as obviously almost bombard the household with different advice and support and triage and things that we think will help. Because to be honest, being in poverty is pretty relentless. Being in crisis is absolutely horrendous too. And sometimes you need to give people a little bit of respite. So we start by saying, we're going to give you some hope. We're going to get your house warm again. And then we're going to use that as the opportunity to try and do some other stuff.
And what would you say to the government about richer pensioners not getting winter fuel payment?
It's really important that the savings which are being made are recycled through the system and are there to provide decent levels of support for people who aren't heating their home properly. Really simple. We're now in a world, aren't we, where we routinely talk about energy prices being 16, 17, 1800 pounds a year. If I went back 5 years ago, 6 years ago, energy prices were around the £1,000 mark for the average household. Energy is so much more expensive than it ever was, but as is so much other stuff. Food is more expensive. Housing costs are more expensive. Everything is more expensive. And so energy just isn't in isolation. And energy is just part of a basket of goods, which has become more and more expensive over time. And that's why it's so important that if winter fuel payment is there to keep people warm, it should be targeted at those people who don't have the ability to keep warm themselves. You know, closing, we call it the fuel poverty gap. And that's really simply, you know, what you need to pay to maintain an acceptable standard of heating or warmth in your home versus what you can pay. I take my mother-in-law as an example, actually. She was a low-income pensioner. She, but like lots of pensioners, actually, kind of asset rich, but cash poor. But she lived in one of these kind of new build retirement homes for pensioners, which had really great insulation. I was really proud of her. You know, her direct debit for electricity was something like 38 quid a month. It was so cheap. You know, she didn't need to heat the home. It was that well insulated. She was on pension credit, but she also used to get winter fuel payment. She didn't need winter fuel payment because she wasn't struggling to keep her home warm because her home was that well insulated. But she'd have friends who she knew who earned a similar amount of money, but the house was old, was leaky, had single glazed windows or double glazed windows which weren't fitted greatly. And so the house used to eat energy and leak heat. And although they might have earned a similar amount of money, they both weren't in fuel poverty. You know, one was, one wasn't. And that's why it's so important that we think about how do we get help to people in a really targeted way. And I think the last thing actually is that, and it's probably a conversation with the government to kind of work through as well. What's the best way to give support to people? If you're struggling to keep yourself warm, is it to give you additional cash to pay your energy bill? Or is it, or should maybe we're just making energy bills cheaper for those people who are struggling? Because maybe if you make the energy bill cheaper, you kind of have a greater level of surety that somebody is going to be living in a warm home. Whereas if you give somebody cash, it's then up to that person to choose how they spend that money. But you don't necessarily know that money has been spent on keeping warm. And so I think from a policy perspective, we've got to think really carefully about, do we want to give people additional money to pay for what they need, or do we want to make the goods and services they take cheaper? It might cost the same money, but you might deliver different outcomes from it.
And finally, Matthew, if a pensioner is worried, what advice would you give?
First of all, I'd say, please don't worry, because worrying isn't great at all for people's health and well-being. Have a look at our website, that's fuelbankfoundation.org. Speak to your local council, have a chat with Citizens Advice or Page UK or any support workers for them to check whether you're receiving everything you're entitled to. Most important thing. If you get an application in for pension credit by mid-December, it'll be backdated for 3 months, and that will also backdate your eligibility for winter fuel payment. That's the most important thing. Check that you're receiving everything you're eligible for.
Thank you, Matthew, for sharing your insight. I'm sure we shall hear more of this issue in months and years to come. But for those who are listening to Debt Talk and want to share your experience or are interested in hearing about a topic that is pressing to you, you can get in touch with me on former Twitter, Your Dr. Debt, or email ripon.ray@yourdrdebt.com. Let me go back to my panel members to provide listeners with top tips for those who are generally considering developing strategies to reduce poverty among pensioners during another winter. Let me ask Ian on this subject to provide Debt Talk listeners with top tips first.
But I think I'll reiterate it because it's important. I think is to seek help with issues around benefit take up. Don't try and complete the form yourself. I think it's also important to consider whether attendance allowance ought to be claimed for someone of pension age because it's not means tested. In other words, it would be paid in addition to pension credit. And similarly, if one were looking at someone under pension age, then by the same token, personal independence payments, that's in the context of benefit maximisation. So yeah, I'd seek advice is all I'd say. It's too complex a matter, and if you don't succeed at the first go, then seek a review of the decision. I think that's vital.
Thank you, Ian. And finally, from Matthew from Fuelback Foundation.
So when I talk to energy companies, the thing they often say is that they could have provided support, but they didn't appreciate the situation their customer was in. So it's to build on what Ian said, really. Reach out, get help, but from an energy perspective, talk to your household energy provider. If you prepay, there's certain things that they should be able to do, but if you pay by direct debit or when a bill comes through the door, there are things they can provide too. So for instance, if you pay when a bill comes through the door, you could save money straight away by moving to direct debit or paying in a different way. Likewise, if you've retired, there's additional things that an energy company is meant to offer for you if that would provide additional support. First thing to do is have the conversation. So many times people don't have a conversation with their energy supplier or provider. And why would they? Because it's not a normal thing you need to do. But absolutely, if you're worried about winter coming or you think there's going to be a problem, speak to them. Also speak to your local authority. Local authorities have a statutory obligation in all 4 countries of the UK to provide support to people who are absolutely struggling. Again, contact them before the problem becomes a crisis. It's really important.
I would like to thank my panel members for giving their precious time out of their busy lives to speak about pensioners and winter fuel payment. Debt Talk did approach the Prime Minister to comment on the precise subject. Unfortunately, I'm still waiting to hear from him. So my next podcast is going to be on scammers and fraudsters targeting vulnerable communities. Thank you for listening to Debt Talk podcast with me, your host, Ripon Ray.